I welcome all of you to the Institute for Spirituality and Health. I'm John Graham. In case I hadn't met you, I just want to give you a warm welcome, tell you how much we appreciate you being here for this important talk, and I really do believe it to be a powerful experience for all of us. The wonderful panel that we have, the guests, will be introduced by our wonderful project manager, who I'd like you to see, Stuart Nelson, who conceived of the idea of this panel and then created the whole thing. He has been so excited all day, waiting on you, and I'm excited too, and we're just very blessed. Stuart, I believe it's your turn.
Thanks, John. Thank you, John. Welcome to the Institute for Spirituality and Health. We're really happy to see you all here. There's a couple housekeeping announcements first before we begin. Most importantly, if any of you parked in the small, non-gated lot, then you should move your car before 7 p.m. Probably right now would be the best time to do that, because if it's after 7, you can't get out of that lot. So you can move your car to the large gated lot. You can push there's a button you push and it'll open. Oh no! Right next to it, there's a gate. As you exit that lot, just turn to your right, and there's a gate right there. To the left. I think you're fine. Bathrooms are outside to the left as well. I don't know if you saw them when you got off their elevators, but they flank the elevators. So we're really happy to see you all here. When we started thinking up this event, I was telling Kathy and the staff here at the ISH that I was going to be really excited if we had 15 or 20 people interested. Well, we had 75 people sign up, and you know, the room is packed now. So we really appreciate that you came, and I think it's a testament to the incredible interest and importance of this topic, and how necessary it is to have topics like this explored in venues such as this one. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kelly McCann from the Alzheimer's Association. She's going to tell you a little bit about what the Alzheimer's Association does here in Houston.
Good evening, everybody. Just want to say that my colleague, Marianne Haynes, and I are here representing the Alzheimer's Association, and we're honored to be here this evening for this important event. I am just as interested as all of you are in hearing from these distinguished panel members, but before we get started, I would like to just share a little bit of information with you, a little bit about Alzheimer's and then about what we do. But let me just begin by saying a special thank you to Dr. Graham and to Lex and to you, Stuart, for including us in this, and also to Father Mike. Thank you very much. If you're not aware, Alzheimer's is a degenerative brain disease, and it robs the individual of memories and judgment and other cognitive abilities, and it also it impairs a person's coordination and their motor skills. Eventually, Alzheimer's will result in death. It is the 6th leading cause of death in our country, and that may take many of you by surprise because we don't hear about it very much, but it is the 6th leading cause of death. It is quite common, unfortunately. Currently, 5 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's disease, and to put a little different statistic on that, 1 in 8 older Americans, so it is quite common. Regarding, as I mentioned, it being the 6th leading cause of death, I want to share with you that of the 10 leading causes of death, Alzheimer's disease is the only one for which there is no way to prevent it, no way to cure it, and not much effective means of even slowing down the progression of the disease. Also, of those 10 leading causes of death, Alzheimer's disease is the only one that within the past decade has continued to show an increase in the number of cases. You see fewer cases of heart disease and stroke and diabetes and HIV and even cancer we're seeing being controlled and fewer deaths from it. The death rate from Alzheimer's disease is increasing. Now, what is especially frustrating for those of us that work in the field is that despite these statistics, despite what I'm telling you about, there really isn't adequate funding right now for research into this disease. And sadly, the situation is only going to get worse. As I stated, currently there are 5 million Americans with this disease. Because of us baby boomers, the projected growth of this disease is quite significant. By 2050, we're expecting a 3-fold increase. So by 2050, rather than 5 million, we're expecting over 15 million Americans will be living with Alzheimer's disease. This is a disease that takes a tremendous physical toll, but I have to share with you, not to be mercenary about it, but it takes a tremendous financial toll as well. Currently, it is over $2 billion a year just to pay for the care for people with Alzheimer's disease. But I have to caution you and say that that $2 billion does not include the millions of hours of unpaid care that's provided by family and friends. If we roll that expense into it, the cost actually doubles to more than $400 billion a year. And with the projected increase in the number of cases by 2050, the cost is estimated to be at $1 trillion annually. Now, to put that in perspective for you, that's greater than the current Medicare budget right now. And it's going to be $1 trillion a year just to treat and care for people with Alzheimer's disease. Obviously, physical, financial tolls, they're pretty obvious, but this is a disease that also takes a huge emotional toll, not only on the person living with the disease, but on their family members and caregivers. And that's where we come into play a lot at the Alzheimer's Association. You know, this is a disease that is accompanied by stigma and shame quite often, social isolation and depression, anger, guilt, you name it. There's a lot of emotions that someone with this disease goes through, as do their caregivers. And in that way, you can see it's a disease that kind of affects the entire person, the entire family, and really the entire community, and even the entire nation when we think about some of the projected numbers and costs. What we do at the Alzheimer's Association is we work with individuals and families to try and help them cope with all of the issues that are a part of this disease. We certainly help them with connecting with a fine physician, and we have a lot of great medical care in Houston. We don't provide the medical care, but we can connect them. We can connect them to resources around legal and financial issues. But some of the more significant things, too, that we do is partly what Marianne does. We help families with care planning. We can help you formulate a plan of action following your loved one's diagnosis. We can help provide support groups so that the caregivers have someone to lean on and to share their experiences with. We have a 24-hour helpline, and that's a very important issue because you may have something come up in the middle of the night, need a little advice, a little assistance. We can certainly help in that way. We also provide educational seminars for the community, and we also do professional training. And out when you leave, we've put some resources out. We are putting on our annual Schlichting Professional Dementia Conference next month, and there are CEUs available for those of you in nursing and social work, etc. So if that's of interest to you, please stop by the table. We even have programs for people living with the disease, programs to keep them socially engaged and intellectually stimulated. And so we have a wide variety of things that we can do to try to help families and people with the disease. But you'll notice as I've listed all the things that we do, I haven't yet mentioned spirituality. And if you'll excuse me just one moment, I'm going to have a Marco Rubio experience. So I remember him from the... This has been your Republican response to the State of the Union. All right, so what I was saying is that we at the Alzheimer's Association, we don't address anything spiritual, yet we certainly have to acknowledge that people have spiritual needs. So the reason we're here tonight and what we're going to hear from this panel is what can those of you in a pastoral role, what can you do to help? What role do you play in the interdisciplinary care team? And I'd like to just share something with you. For people who are suffering from dementia or memory loss, familiar religious rituals or sacraments, prayers and hymns or songs, they can often bring tremendous peace and comfort to the person with Alzheimer's disease. Even if the significant meaning of those rituals or songs are lost, the comfort, the peace, the emotions still remain. And so I hope that all of you will remember that and make sure that you include your loved ones in religious rites or spiritual expressions. And to that end, I want to read you a quote from Maria Shriver. She made a comment about a similar situation involving her father, Sergeant Shriver, who suffered from Alzheimer's disease and had the related cognitive losses. Maria, several years ago, wrote, quote, "At 93, my dad still goes to Mass every day. And believe it or not, he still remembers the Hail Mary, but he doesn't remember me." So that should kind of give us that significant message about how on a very core, very internal, very spiritual level, what we have to offer on a spiritual, what you have to offer on it from a spiritual perspective is vastly important to people with this disease. But your role as a spiritual advisor or spiritual guide, it doesn't stop with the person with the disease. You certainly can offer a lot to the family members as well. While I said earlier that this is a disease that has no cure, that doesn't mean that healing can't happen. And that's where you come into play. And it's through your support and your calm presence and you're helping them to still engage in those spiritual expressions. By doing that, you're the ones that truly make that kind of healing possible, that allow people to find peace and maybe even help them find some sort of meaning to this illness and their greater purpose in life. And so I thank you for what you do and what you are about to do. And I'm glad that we're all in this together. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And we're really thankful for everything the Alzheimer's Association is doing to raise awareness and combat this disease. So I'd like to introduce to you now the Reverend Dr. Michael Gemignani, who's going to be sharing a very a deeply personal story with you all this evening. Dr. Gemignani holds a PhD and a JD. Among other positions, he has served as Dean in Arts of Sciences at the University of Maine and is Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs at the University of Houston Clear Lake. He was Rector of St. Paul's, Freeport, and founded the Brazosport Medical Center with the help of Episcopal Health Charities. Dr. Gemignani is a longtime spiritual director, and he chaired the Division of Spiritual Formation for the Episcopal Diocese of Texas for 8 years. He is the author of 14 books and more than 100 articles in mathematics, computer science, law, and spiritual formation. I encourage you to write down questions on the cards we've provided to you as you listen to his talk, so that we can ask them to panelists, including Dr. Gemignani, later in the program. Thank you.
I want to thank Stuart first for practicing for 15 minutes before this to pronounce my name correctly. To paraphrase Leo Tolstoy, happy families are all alike. Every family in which a loved one suffers from dementia is unhappy in its own way. My beloved wife, Nilda, died of Alzheimer's disease at the end of May last year after a gradual but relentless decline of more than 10 years. Like almost every case of Alzheimer's, her decline began slowly, almost imperceptibly, easily ignored or taken for what might be the normal decline of memory as one grows older. Perhaps we might liken the beginning of Alzheimer's to a small rivulet. The stream broadens and gathers strength until it flows into a broad river that is carrying the patient along in its turbulent current. The river grows wider and deeper, the patient drifting further and further from the shore until the river empties into the mighty sea of death. And I, the lover, the caregiver, run along the bank, calling out to my beloved to return, unable to save her, unable even to enter the river so that I might understand her journey as she drifts in a world of her own until she vanishes from sight. But this is not a talk about the scourge of Alzheimer's or Nilda's journey, but about my journey. Nor is it a talk about all that I had to do to care for her when she was unable to care for herself. It is not about what I did for Nilda, but about what God did for me. Life is a school to learn how to love. When we take a spouse, we think we are doing so because we love that person. In the marriage ceremony, we pledge to love and support our spouse in good times and bad, in sickness and in health. But it is not when we are married that we learn how to love, but during the course of the marriage. And if we do not learn how to love our spouse as the years roll on, the marriage will die, even if there is no divorce. It is in dealing with a spouse with dementia that love is tested to its limits, and the meaning of love becomes engraved on the soul. When Nilda first realized that she was entering a dark tunnel, losing control of her mind, she lashed out, became angry, and I was the target of most of her anger because I was close at hand. At such a time, I had to learn how to support her in her anger and her distress, even though I did not understand it. And even though I myself became angry and burdened because this is not the way life was supposed to be. We were both losing control over the direction our lives would take, and neither of us recognized the extent of the tragedy that was unfolding. Frankly, I was angry because of the serious inconvenience that Nilda's odd behavior was causing me. I was a busy rector of a parish and active in community and diocesan business, not to mention chair of the board of a medical center that I had founded. I was losing control over my life as Nilda was losing control over hers. Was I to turn away from my one spouse so that I would be available to serve many? There are times when life presents us with choices we do not want to have to make, choices we never thought we would be called on to make, choices that force us to decide what our real priorities are, choices that require us to decide what love means and what love requires. Love does not make its primary home in our emotions, but in the choices we make and why we make them. As Nilda drifted farther into the dark tunnel of her disease, abated, and now even more ill, she came into a land of her own, a land of illusions, a land where for the most part she lived in the past asking for her long-dead parents, wanting me to take her home, home being the house in Muncie, Indiana, where she had lived as a child. The house we were in was the wrong house. I needed to take her to the corner so she could catch a bus to go home. When were her parents going to be there? As most of you know, you do not argue with an Alzheimer's patient. Neither do you lie to them. Oddly, though they often cannot remember what you said 5 minutes ago, they are often preternaturally efficient at catching you at a lie. So you do not lie. Your parents are not home usually suffices. the owner of this house is letting us stay here as long as we want. Usually quieted Nilda's concerns that we were in a house in which we did not belong. Nilda was living in one world and I in another, and which was the more real? In which one was God more present? When a human being loses touch with reality, whatever reality might mean, when she no longer has short-term memory, when she no longer can care for even her most basic needs, is she still fully human? This was the woman I loved, and she was still the woman I loved. But she was no longer the woman I married. And so I had to offer her to God, to place her in God's hands to love and care for as only God could, while I tended to her physical needs. And yet I still told her how many times how much I loved her. And I tried to treat her gently and with all the respect that love demands. And in her own way, I knew she loved me. There were times I cried. One time was when it was our 25th wedding anniversary, and I asked Nilda if she knew what it was. Of course, I knew she couldn't remember, so I told her it was our anniversary and we had been married 25 years. Her response, delivered so innocently, was, "Are we married?" It felt crushing, and I left the room and wept. I am not proud of the way I acted many times during the course of her disease, particularly when I did not understand the reasons for her actions. I became impatient and angry. Even after she was officially diagnosed at the Baylor Geriatric Clinic, I was not always as kind or controlled as I would have liked. It was a relief to have a diagnosis at last. But even after that, I was ashamed of the way I acted at times when Nilda made far more work for me than I would have had to do if she could have followed some simple instructions. But she could not follow those simple instructions. And if she could follow them, she could not remember them. Her dying involved my dying too. This was the most spiritually powerful aspect of this long and difficult journey that Nilda and I made together. She was dying mentally and physically. I was dying to self in a deep spiritual sense. I was giving up what I wanted for what she needed and for what I had come to realize love demanded. I was giving up control of my life in the name of love. I was giving myself to someone who needed my love and my care as she slipped more and more toward death. I was giving up all of the plans and dreams I had had of the good times we were going to have together once I was retired. I was learning patience, greater self-control, and our marriage was growing deeper and more spiritually profound than ever before. If, as I noted, life is a school to learn how to love, then Nilda's illness had to contain lessons in love. It forced me to examine my own pride, my own humanity, all that it meant to be human. In preparing this talk, I tried to clarify what spiritual lessons I had received from this experience, and so I will now try to summarize them. First, Nilda's illness forced me to examine my priorities and to order them appropriately. If obedience to God was my highest priority, then I knew in my head and in my heart that being with Nilda was where I had to be, and caring for her was what I had to do. It forced me to recall the vows I had exchanged with my beautiful wife, Nilda. I had made promises to her, but not merely to her, but to God. I had a responsibility to care for her, not just out of human compassion and my natural love for her, but out of love for God. My walking with her through the long period of her decline was a continuous act of love for God, and God walked beside us both. In being faithful to Nilda, I knew, being faithful to God. Second, I had to learn where God was in Nilda's irreversible deterioration. And I repeat again, life is a school to learn how to love. We are to learn to love creation, one another, ourselves, and most of all, God. Perhaps I could have placed Nilda in a care facility and gone about the business of trying to do great things, whatever those might have been. And many of my great lessons in love, though, were learned in taking care of Nilda, abandoning my own will to God's will. And God was there patiently teaching me, even as His grace sustained me through very difficult times. Third, I regained the gift of tears. In my growing up as a boy and then as a man, I was taught that tears demonstrated weakness, and I had to be strong. God cured me of that folly, and I learned how to cry. Tears are a gift. They cleanse and heal. I pity those who cannot cry. Tears are a form of reaching out to God, whether with tears of joy or tears of pain. We can relate to God more powerfully through our tears than words. Fourth, this experience impressed on me the uncertainty of life and my inability to control my future. I had to place myself entirely in the hands of God to take me where God would. At the same time, this uncertainty and the difficulties of caring for Nilda taught me a greater compassion for others who were suffering. If I were younger and in better health, I would probably train to be a nurse and work free in a community clinic. But I'm neither young nor am I in good health, and so my ministry must be elsewhere. But at least I believe my own experience and the education I gained from it has enabled me to help others who find themselves as caregivers for loved ones. Fifth, the experience taught me the importance of spiritual support. Because of my extensive work in the church, I had literally thousands of Christians praying for me and for Nilda. We were surrounded by a loving community who cared about us and who were there for us when we needed them. In addition to the spiritual support, there was a physical support provided by friends and professional caregivers. Many were truly in this together with both Nilda and myself. Those who suffer most are those who suffer alone, and no one should be alone in time of tragedy. I also learned how to accept help and support from others, to be ministered to rather than simply to minister. Unfortunately, this is a lesson that many Christians never learn. Sixth, I had to learn patience. As I said, at first I was both impatient and sometimes angry, but I intentionally prayed to be healed of both impatience and anger, so that I could do even the most menial tasks, even tasks that some home health aides shied away from, with genuine affection. God, I believe, did heal me of my impatience. So in the later years of Nilda's illness, I could do whatever I had to do out of love rather than necessity, and in a spirit of love rather than mere duty. I still did get angry and impatient, but that was when I saw instances of inhumanity in our medical system, its bias against the elderly, and at times even gross incompetence. But I also encountered truly compassionate doctors. nurses who exemplified the highest traditions of their profession, and professionals who were as concerned about their patients as suffering human beings as they were about modeling the best practices of their art. Perhaps this is a spiritual issue, perhaps not, but it is nevertheless a question for another time. Seventh, during the time of Nilda's illness, my prayer life deepened. Not in the sense of being able to express my concerns to God or to tell God what I wanted God to do for me, but I developed a deeper relationship with God, a sense of God's presence that transcended words. I did not just believe, but I knew that God was there with me and Nilda. I am, truth be told, a mystic. I define a mystic as someone who experiences ultimate reality, which for me, of course, is God. It is not that a mystic knows what to believe about God or what to say about God, but the mystic knows God, experiences God as real. I am not suggesting that by caring for Nilda I somehow earned any special rewards from God. What God gives freely. Indeed, my struggles during Nilda's illness taught me, as St. Paul phrased it, how short I fell of the glory of God. But God was present. God was present in a powerful, palpable way at times when I cared for Nilda, and this despite all my flaws I could find when I engaged in self-examination. The ordeal of caring for a loved one confronts us with many terrible questions. Have I done enough? Have I done too much? Should I call 911 or wait to see what happens? Should I focus on her comfort and quality of life or on her safety? And what if she should die because she chokes on food she enjoys but that might be hazardous because she has trouble swallowing? How do I try to keep her from doing things that are dangerous, that she insists on doing, while respecting her dignity and trying as best I can to avoid hurting her physically or emotionally? What is possible? What is impossible? What does God want me to do in a situation where there seem to be no good options? Is now the time that all treatment should cease and I should allow my loved one to die? The time came when Nilda was on hospice and her organs were shutting down, and the hospice nurse asked if I wanted to send Nilda to the hospital. With tears in my eyes, I said I could not do that. I could not do that to Nilda. She died about a week later. I know I made the right decision. But I also know we live in a death-denying society where medicine considers death a failure, and where families will often subject their loved ones to invasive and painful treatments, where there is no hope of a patient's regaining any quality of life, and where the only result is prolonged suffering for the patient and the caregiver. This is indeed one of the profound spiritual issues of our time. 3 days after Nilda died, God dumped an entire bucket of heaven on my head and transformed my life. Nilda's memorial service was one of the most beautiful I have ever been a part of. A time of sorrow, yes, but a time of rejoicing. There is probably no human disease more devastating than Alzheimer's, so perhaps a takeaway I can give in this talk is that even in such devastating circumstances, God can and does act in powerful ways, as God acted in my situation. But I also know there are those who are faced with this terrible disease who rail at God, who do not find any of that peace that passes understanding, or any peace at all, but only sorrow and loss. If it were possible, I would gladly give other caregivers the peace that God gave me. But as I was reminded by a wise spiritual advisor, that peace is not mine to give. But I am convinced that it is critically important that spirituality enter the life of someone caring for a desperately ill loved one, or the plight of the caregiver will be worse than that of the patient. It is a sad fact that the majority of those who are the primary caregivers of a loved one with dementia die before the patient. What can we do to bring a deeper spirituality into the lives of caregivers? I do not have any clear answer. Perhaps the Institute or some of our panel might have suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gemignani. Sacred moments like those from the stories of individuals are a large part of why the Institute exists, I think. And so we were blessed to have Dr. Gemignani be with us here this evening. We'll now hear from our panelists, and I'll collect the question cards. Please pass them to your right when I'll come down the aisle and collect them, so that we can ask your questions. Dr. Sheila LoboPrabhu is an associate professor at the Menninger Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Baylor College of Medicine. She has published many articles and book chapters on attachment, loneliness, spirituality, and elder care. Dr. LoboPrabhu lectures nationally, focusing on geriatric psychiatry. We're very, very fortunate to have her here with us this evening. Reverend Helen Appelberg is a fellow in the Searle Center on Aging and director of the Center for Spirituality and Aging. In 1994, Helen founded the Community of Hope, a lay chaplain training program now in churches and hospitals across the nation and in Canada, Mexico, and Malawi. Ordained for 23 years, she continues to serve as the associate to the rector at Grace Episcopal Church in Galveston. Dr. Andy Achenbaum is a professor of history and social work at the University of Houston, where he holds the Gerson and Sabina David Professorship in Global Aging. Dr. Achenbaum has served on the board of the Alzheimer's Association of Southeast Texas and has been affiliated with the Institute for Spirituality and Health since 2007. Columbia University Press will issue his biography of the late Robert N. Butler, MD, in early summer. We're very, very lucky to have all the panelists with us, so now I'll hand it over to Dr. LoboPrabhu.
When I first read what Dr. Gemignani had written, are you all able to hear me? Closer? Better? Okay. When I first read what Dr. Gemignani read out to you, my first instinct was, wow. Then I read it again. Each time you read it, it's like a different paragraph jumps out at you, you know? My principal impression of that was that I've come in contact through his writing and now in person with one of the most special people I have met in my life. So I want to take this moment just to acknowledge him for what a wonderful caregiver he has been. I've never met him. So I work every day at the VA hospital here at the corner, and I'm one of the 3 outpatient geriatric psychiatrists, so my work is dementia care. And I've been working there for about the last 13 years. When I first graduated my residency, I'm interested in the medical interface of psychiatry and internal medicine. So I did a fellowship at Texas Heart, and that is a very exciting place because there's all kinds of psychiatric consultations going on to all kinds of medical illnesses. So when I accepted the job at the VA, it was a little shocking to switch from a kind of a high-paced, high-modality hospital to a part of the practice that was just really kind of ongoing dementia care for years and years and years. And I was rather young. I was 29 when I joined. So, it was flabbergasting to be following panels of patients you were going to be following for the long haul. And in the beginning, I think in my immaturity, I didn't realize what exactly families go through. And I think as I've grown older and I've written out some of the problems of Alzheimer's disease with families, I've learned many things, and mostly from the families. What they have taught me is that it is one of the most difficult diseases to care for, that I wish there was a treatment. In fact, I spent last week giving the same lecture on Alzheimer's disease to the medical students and egging them on to find a treatment. So I spent most of the lecture pepping them up and saying, look here, you have to find this, okay? I'm passing the baton. They're like, you're not that old. So I said, no, no, no. Those of you who are going to be neurologists, you have to do this. But what I find myself doing is prescribing the medications that slow down the course of the disease and being there for whatever happens to come into the office that day. And it may be a patient who's agitated, having more delusions or hallucinations. It might be a nursing home patient who's more agitated with incontinence and I have to deal with the delirium. Or it might be a family member who is like, I can't stand this anymore. You take this patient or I'm going to do something to him. So you really don't know what you're going to get as you open that door and you take the patient and the family in. And the interesting thing about following families through the whole course of the disease is you get to see families like Nilda who are well cared for and well beloved and well looked after by a very, very loving spouse and cared for by the community. And then there are people who have nobody. There are people who have made big mistakes in the way of alcohol or substances. There are people who have gone to war and lost everybody when they came home, their girlfriend or their wife has married somebody else. Then you've got people who lived on the street and really don't have anybody. And you have to deal with all these laws, the Medicaid laws and the Medicare laws and all these things that go along with Alzheimer's disease, which is the legal and the money implications. And when we think of spirituality in this, it just seems overwhelming because you don't know what crisis you're dealing with, and you're sort of, from the doctor's point of view, I mean, to be inelegant about it, you're sort of flying by the seat of your pants kind of thing, You don't know what's coming through the door, and you hope you're saying the right thing, and you're doing all the training that you were taught to do. But there are curveballs that come in, and things where you have to interface with the doctor downstairs, the primary care doctor, and things when you're not quite sure that you know what you're doing and you hope that you're doing the right thing and that you're following the standard of care. And then other times when things come in that are so shocking, you just don't know what to say. Like I had one daughter who came in some years ago, and she was very, very angry at her dad because he had abused her. And I listened, and her whole assessment was not really, I don't know who I was assessing because, the daughter was really upset and it was pretty consuming. And it was also clear that the father was not really safe in her care because she wasn't trusting herself to do the right thing because she didn't know that she could get past the anger. And in a very sick patient, they really are at the mercy of the caregiver. So a lot of spirituality comes in listening and understanding who needs in that room. So it's beautiful to see what the Reverend here was saying about what he felt about his wife, because he's at a level of understanding, I think, that is higher than many, many people. And what many, many people may realize during the course of the journey, or may come in not realizing and come out realizing later on, or spiritually may never get to that level at all. So I think it's important for us as caregivers to keep an open mind about what we have to offer and to be willing to work as a team. In fact, when I saw the panel, I thought, wow, this is like a multidisciplinary team of panelists. There's a PhD, a psychologist, there's a pastoral care expert, then there's an MD. So this is exactly what we do in a healthcare setting, because I don't presume to have all the answers. By the time I finish the medication check, quite often, the time has run out. I'm already over. And sometimes it's when I'm writing my note later on that I digest it and I think, woo, I missed that. I should have. And then you pick up the phone and maybe you call the social worker, or there's a chaplaincy issue that has to be addressed. There's been times I've gone and reached the home chaplain, of the church out in the community. I'll call the chaplain directly. I've had to do that a few times because the spouse may be in pastoral counseling. And so you have to reach out across the bridge if you can get a release of information. But you have to be willing to do anything. And that's why I like that team approach, because that's what helps us go on with the long haul. Otherwise, you would give up. You would just give up, sometimes. And sometimes when you lose a patient and you think maybe you could have done, should have done, would have done more, that's what keeps the team going, is that the social worker may have more strength that day, or the psychologist may just have done a better, understanding, or and may be able to give some perspective to the whole thing. So that's what I wanted to bring. Thank you.
I've known Mike Gemignani. I can say it because I've said it so many times. I guess maybe from the beginning of your coming to Texas. And yet we lost touch. And I guess when I want to tell a bit of the personal story, it's the story that we all experience. I lost touch with where they lived. We weren't near each other geographically, saw each other very seldom. So I really wasn't able to get enough understanding of what was happening with your wife. And that's a point, I think, of both spiritual connection and the thing that many of you who are experiencing some of what you heard Reverend Jim and Young, can I just call you Mike? That when the going really gets tough, some of the people that have been there for you and with you and in your surroundings are no longer present. In your case, you had people in the immediate congregation where you were that came. But many of us don't live where our immediate congregations are. And sometimes that whole thing of stigma gets in the way. So we may not want to tell everybody. It would be really good if you could catch hold of what's needed in this family. And it's going to be not just a couple of years or 3 years. It may be 8 or 9. How many years was it for you, Mike? 10. And many of the, our dear lady who's, and you're from the Alzheimer's Association too, aren't you? Would say that might be about the length of time. But the thing I know about Mike Gemignani is that as a professor, I remember a lot of us sort of took a deep breath when we met him for the first couple of times we were all together as clergy, because we said, "Oh, this man is just one of the most intellectually bright people we've ever met," and you are. It's a gift you have. He had written lots of books. He had been a professor. He'd been in a lot of places before he became an Episcopal clergy. And the thing that strikes me so about your story and your experience with your wife is that as much as you treasure the intellect and the ability to think well, and this is part of our culture, and that's the other point I want to make, that most of us have our identity wrapped around the way we've been able to achieve with our mental capacity. We put a lot of weight on being able to remember. We do that with our children. Who remembers how to spell the word and all the answers to the math questions and can remember to do things backwards and forwards in all kinds of funny ways? And the kid that can't do it is the one who, well, not exactly included with all of the upscale things. But with your wife losing the sense of her mental capacity, and she certainly had hers. You were willing to allow your life and your thinking to transcend what was being lost so that you could be with her on this journey. That's when your spiritual life got turned upside down in a new and different way. And that's how you began to share it with us. And when we think of spirituality and aging and spirituality and Alzheimer's, what can we as caregivers, and in some ways all of us will be an extended neighbor, member of a group, a congregation of concerned friends who want to knock on the door and say, how can I help? Is there something I can do? Help break down and tear down and cut through those barriers and make yourself available and to make your caring available. When we talk about spiritual presence and concerns for the person who's suffering this really terrible and irreversible disease, the one thing we can believe and know is the mind may be going in reverse and losing what it had, but the soul of the human being, the very spirit and the core of that person, is still very much alive and intact. And the ways we can believe that is just to act on it by being present, non invasive, non confrontive, quiet, compassionate, not coming in so that I can do something to you, because that may be the most interruptive thing you can do, but to be with, to be present, to be able to listen without asking questions, without expecting anything back. Mike, as you talked, you reminded me of an article that I read recently by a specialist in Alzheimer's and spirituality. Her name is Nancy Gordon. She runs a center in California for the Lutheran Church. And she said, and you demonstrated this. She said, when we're with the Alzheimer's patients and we want to encourage and love them in a very spiritual and nurturing way, we try to do two things. We remember as God remembers, and we love as God loves. We go back and look at the Hebrew, the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, the New Testament. We read and study religions across the face of humanity. But to be the compassionate other and to remember the way God remembers. And to love the way God loves. I will often wonder, as you told your story, if there was music, if there were certain things you could do in way of prayers that she responded to because they were the prayers that she had known as a child, or if there was music in her life that she wanted to hear that gave her pleasant and happy memories. Were those did those things happen? But I'm asking because I think it's important to know. Well, the point I'd like to make is that whether that happened in their experience, it happens in the experience of most of our persons who are experiencing Alzheimer's. To connect with them spiritually by being sensitive to either the music, the art, or the prayers that they knew as children. Singing Christmas carols, old hymns, listening for the prayers. That could be the prayer that was the prayer of their childhood. Are the ways to offer that awakening. I know that you mentioned that oftentimes you go, or you found ways for the two of you to go to church, or to go and remember the practices of spiritual practice that she liked, and that gave her comfort and joy. And so I just want to thank you for helping us to remember that giving care and letting go of the things that we care for ourselves, the self-giving, is what makes the difference.
Old age is not for sissies. Art Linkletter made a lot of money off a book by that title, and truth be told, he plagiarized. Betty Davis made that line in 1936. I'm a boomer. I'm 65. I have had a few rodeos in my life. I have had great moments, and I know time is getting shorter and shorter. And so I focus in on the essentials. The day I held a grandchild was more poignant than holding my firstborn, and easier because I could hand her off. There are certain desserts I won't eat even in Lent, but you show me a lemon square and I'll kill you for it. I am more obnoxious now than I ever was, and I was fairly obnoxious at 10. But I'm also sobered enough to realize that the last part of life has some shadows. Kelly gave us some very grim statistics. And as a boomer who has studied aging for a while, they terrify me. Robert Butler, whose biography I wrote, was the guy who put Alzheimer's disease on the national map at the National Institute on Aging. And 2 weeks before he died, I said, we've spent all these billions of dollars. What have we gotten? He chastised me. We've made progress. We're going to die. This is not my first encounter with death. My best friend in high school was killed in an auto wreck at 16. I lost friends in wars. I've lost students in wars. It was my generation, the generation that was given polio vaccine, that had to face up to the reality of AIDS. And now I go to college reunions, and the class, which was small to begin with, is thinner yet. How do we respond to all of this? A fellow named George Valent, a Harvard psychiatrist who's written several books about the longitudinal studies of some privileged brats from Harvard and tied it in with some people who came from lower income, says that we have a variety of ways. Some people are disgustingly optimistic. Some people narcotize themselves. And if they narcotize themselves too often, then they get a negative quality of substance abuse and alcoholism. And some despair. The isolation that Kelly talked about leads to a higher incidence of suicide. And so yes, Alzheimer's looms large in this story. And it's time for me to get to that. And I want to get to that with a personal example myself. My mother smoked 2 packs of cigarettes from the time she was 4 until the time she was 70. For some odd reason, she developed coronary pulmonary disease. My mother was a pit bull. Bless her heart. Helen knew her. Helen and she worked together in the late 50s in Philadelphia at a church school. And there she was, the woman who made C. Everett Koch, the Surgeon General of the United States who banned smoking, go outside the halls of Philadelphia's Children's Hospital so she could have a cigarette, found herself now in her later years very vulnerable. I was her eldest, probably her least favorite. So we played cat and mouse. I noticed a lot of dents on her car. This is bad. You should see my car. It's genetic. But I feared that it was caused by her bad driving. I don't know a bloody thing about auto mechanics. I passed shop. But I figured out how to open up the hood, and I just pulled out every plug I could find. She tried to start the car the next day, couldn't start it, called her friendly auto mechanic, whipped out a MasterCard. You guessed the rest. And so we went. But resilience is a key part of being a caregiver, especially in later years. If you can't laugh about it sometimes, get a life. Get a life. And love is clearly a part of this. As I listened to Father Mike talk, I realized how many different dimensions I thought about love. Frankly, I think a lot about sex. I think a lot about friendship. And yes, I know there are a lot of clergy in here. I can spell agape. But the sort of love that we want to talk about, it seems to me, is that love which recognizes that every human being is not a shell. That every human being, because they are blessed with an inner spirit, have been graced with dignity. And that dignity, that worth, is what impels us all. Even in the mid-stages of Alzheimer's, my mother would ask me if I'd had enough to eat. Eat. 20 pounds had to go off after she died. And spirituality. She was really a good church woman. Drove rectors crazy, but she was a good church woman. And when we got to the end, she was in hospice. She had multiple, and that's what makes Alzheimer's so complicated, is there are these comorbid patterns which go on. And it's really hard to tell where the one begins and the other ends. And you can't tell if depression isn't underlying some of this, but I'm not the psychiatrist on the panel. It was time for last rites. I did not know the rector of the church I had been raised in. I'd been away for a long time. She didn't like the rector of the church she went to. But this was no time for mainline formality. This was the time to invoke a rite, a ritual, in which God joined caregivers and that person who was dying. You knew they were dying. She knew she was dying. But damn if she couldn't remember the Our Father. Damn if she could not remember. That spirit was there. And so it seems to me that I have two lessons. One, we are all patients. And by definition, a patient is one who suffers. Not morosely, but suffers, touches it. And so the feelings of empathy and compassion are that we're in this all together. This is no time to end on a somber note. I'll steal a line from Helen. We are a community of hope. And the hope is that that little grandchild who I held will live safely and soundly in a great country, that medicine will prevail, and some of the hardcore traditional values which have made this country great will continue to prevail.
Thank you so much, panelists. We all really, really appreciate you being here. I'd like to just say one more time, if you're parked, because 7 o'clock is approaching soon, if you're parked in the small visitors lot immediately to the left when you exit this building, you need to move your car because you will be locked in after 7 o'clock. If you walk out the door and immediately turn left, that's okay. Don't say I didn't warn you. Okay, so now I'm going to collect question cards. If you could pass them down this way, I'd be really grateful. Question cards? Anybody have any question cards? Thank you. Write a couple down. We need some. Any more cards? Any questions? Thanks.
That's to the panelists to the left.
Ah, excellent. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. If you have more, you can kind of signal and I'll run down and grab it as the panelists are answering. So the first question we have here, I think, can be directed to all the panelists. And if you could just be very brief, we don't have so much a lot more time left, but I'm going to broaden the question because I think it's a really good one. The question is, was there a specific short prayer or verse you could repeat in the midst of a difficult situation? And I'll tag on to that. Is there a specific practice, a short practice or a small practice you used in the midst of a difficult situation as you're confronted with Alzheimer's and dementia?
I think that in my case, it was simply admitting to myself that I didn't have the strength to do what needed to be done, and I had to admit that to God and to open myself to God's power to enable me to carry on, and not only to carry on, but to allow God to transform me just as Nilda was in her way being transformed.
Hymns work. I think one word suffices. Just repeat it, and repeat it, and repeat it. And the repetition and the act of you engaging with them should help.
I agree with you, Andy. Hymns really do work. I find that the light-hearted songs like Jingle Bells, one of the favorite Christmas carols, Silent Night. Our Father does work for some. If you just begin the Lord's Prayer, you need to know the prayer. It helps to know some of the prayers of the person that they might have prayed as a child or when they repetitiously through their lives. But oftentimes, when I'm with people whose childhood I know nothing about, I might begin to say or sing something like a lullaby, Rockabye Baby. I remember the things I did with my dolls. And so I may do those things. And sometimes I may get nothing back. Or just to sit and find any kind of music and sing it. Music seems to be such a deep soul connection for so many of us with persons who aren't speaking, who haven't spoken, or to lean over and just whisper to them, I love you. God loves you. You're beautiful. Just words of comfort that are about the person. And sometimes you get a whisper back.
There's actually a neurological basis for the use of ritual and prayer and song. There's two types of memory in the brain. There's declarative memory and there's procedural memory. Declarative memory is new memory. So for example, if I give you a page of 10 words and I tell you to learn them, you're going to use declarative memory to learn it. Procedural memory is what you already know. So for example, riding a bike, if you haven't ridden from the age of 8 to the age of 18 and we pop you on a bike and you're able to ride that bike, that's because you have the procedural memory come back from when you were 8. And that's probably why the use of ritual and prayer and song is so important in the use of dementia care, is because that's very soothing and it talks directly to the deep brain, which is not so much of the cortex but the deep brain, because it is very soothing and it evokes deeper brain functions and is just naturally very soothing. Now, that is true for song and prayer and anything that is overlearned or habitual and is very soothing. But there's a lot of families that tell me that prayer is even better. And prayer, I think, is not just associated with comfort and ritual and pathways, but it's also associated with emotional feelings of being cared for by God and being looked after by God. So it brings back some of those very original feelings. And so whenever families tell me we pray and he calms down, or when we're saying the rosary, he calms down, please continue it. Keep going, because that's very helpful.
Thanks. This next question, I think, is geared towards Dr. LoboPrabhu. Doctor, why do we use drugs to slow the progress of Alzheimer's if there's no drugs that can cure Alzheimer's?
There's two major types of medications that we use in Alzheimer's disease at this point. They're both not treatments, they're not curative treatments, but they do have actual function and they do delay the progression of the dementia. The first group of medications is called the acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. And what it does is it works on a brain chemical called acetylcholine, and it prevents how the body degrades or gets rid of acetylcholine. So the acetylcholine that is around has to stay over time and keep working. And Aricept, which is also called donepezil, Exelon, which is also called rivastigmine, galantamine, which is also called razidine, they all three act by that mechanism. And they're given either once a day or twice a day. But what they do is, by making this chemical work longer, the person stays alert longer, they're able to recall a little longer, and it might stabilize the course of the illness for memory and for behavior, both. And it may stabilize things for a few years. The earlier you give it in the course of disease, the better. And it may last for quite a while. In fact, we carry this on for almost the whole 10 years of the dementia, because there's known behavioral and memory effects. The second group of medications, so far there's only one that's on the market, but I think there's going to be more, is Namenda, also called memantine. That one is a glutamate antagonist, and so what it does is, glutamate is damaging to the brain, and this one blocks glutamate. So you can use one from each category. The first one is approved for all the stages of the disease, the acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. But the memantine is more for moderate to severe disease. So usually what I tend to do is to start a medication like Aricept early in the disease, and then if they start to drop function, then we add the memantine. Neither of them are cures, but by stabilizing the course of the disease, they maximize the time you can spend at home. And for many families, that's something that they want. They want the loved one at home as long as possible. Cost-wise and affordability-wise, the cost of personal care home and nursing home care is very large. So if families can manage at home, they want to manage at home. And every year that you delay a placement is like anywhere between $50,000 to $100,000 saved to the family or to society. And so as a goal of society at large, we want early intervention and early treatment. So those are that group of medications. In the second stage, which is the moderate to the severe stage of the disease, you see the complications, which are delusions, hallucinations, agitation, paranoia, suspiciousness, hostility. And those respond to a group of medications that is called the antipsychotics. It's the same group of medicines we use in schizophrenia, but they're used off-label because the FDA has not approved them, but these medicines are available to treat the complications. These medications have also been black box warned, which means that you have a higher risk of heart disease and stroke once you start these medicines. However, research hasn't given us alternatives to these medicines, so unfortunately what we have is what we're stuck with. So once we start these medicines, we really work with the family in trying to keep the patient active, to keep somebody exercised and well, about diet, to do everything we can to kind of try to neutralize that risk. But that's the drugs that are the second group of add-on for the middle stage of the disease. Alzheimer's patients are at high risk for other things like cardiac disease. They're at high risk for all the other complications of aging at an accelerated rate. So they'll have cardiovascular disease because they don't get around much. They'll have heart disease, blood pressure, all the risk factors for stroke. So a lot of Alzheimer's care pays attention to those risk factors and works on catching them early and getting them under control. So although it looks like there's nothing to do, there's plenty to do. And then because they're kind of slowed down, they have bladder infections or disorders of the immune system, like pneumonias and coughs and colds. And so we have to look after those and catch those early. So we aggressively immunize come September because we want to prevent that whole group of illnesses that these poor patients really kind of suffer from throughout the fall and winter. So that's why it's important to keep coming, because we look after you through that all.
So I'm going to ask a question that's been alluded to a couple times, both in the main presentation and in your response just now. How important is home and a supportive family in quality of life and in longevity and happiness in these Alzheimer's cases? And I think this is one that you might all have a unique contribution to. And if you don't, then just you can pass the microphone on.
I would say blessed and fortunate in being able to keep Nilla at home, except for the several times when she needed to be in skilled nursing for rehabilitation. And that's an ideal situation, but I know people who can't do that because it's simply too difficult. And I'd had markers myself. I said if we reached this particular point, Nilla would not be safe at home, and I would not be safe at trying to take care of her. And I knew that if we reached one of those markers, I'd have to put her in residential care. And one thing I would advise you is, if you are thinking of putting people in someone in residential care, visit the nursing home and look at it very carefully. Nilda was in 3 different nursing homes for rehabilitation. There was only one of those 3 that I would not have had serious nightmares about with putting her in that particular setting.
Smoking. Mom, you really are going to burn the house down. And we had to go cat and dog. She never went into a home. But if she lived in Houston with me, which she didn't, I would call the Alzheimer's Association, or I'd call the local area on agency and get lists of names of places that they might suggest I investigate. It is as tough a decision as picking whether or not you're going to go to Rice or the University of Houston.
I wish there was a real answer to that question. And some of you, as experts about place, might know. I have experienced families in that very difficult place of having to, for various reasons, knowing that they needed and they had to place their loved one in a care center. But there's something innate within us about place. This is my place. And I would say that that the people that I have known and families I've journeyed with through the stages of Alzheimer's that Mike experienced with his wife, who were able to keep their loved one at home in place, they seem to have a different sense, not that they knew, but it was familiar even though they weren't conscious of the things that were familiar to them that are familiar to us. And there was a sense of the family being able to come and go and take turns caring and taking part in the care, and friends and those who came for support in a place where they could come to the home as compared to being in an institutional setting. So that just comes from something very deep within me that I've experienced through time with families. And I would say that one day my children may look at each other and say, we don't think we can do this anymore for reasons that none of us can explain. And they would have to say, it's time to take Mom to the place that's going to be better for her. And many families, and I've watched families make that choice. And we've worked together and we've wept together, and they've gone about doing what they needed to do, but they never lost that close touch. So when that has to happen, it's the being connected by touch, by presence, by being there, whether the person knows they're there or not. That's not what matters. It's knowing that you know.
I have never met a patient who says, I want to go to a nursing home. Not once. Everybody wants to stay home. So, I think common sense would say that they just want to stay home because that's the place they know. You're the king of your castle. You know where the remote is. You know where the bathroom is. If you want to go fix yourself a snack, you can go to the refrigerator. As long as they're safe at home, we want them at home because they know their environment and they're actually safer in terms of fall risk, of knowing where everything is. They're likely to be eating a healthier diet at home because as long as the family's caring and nurturing and looking after them, we're good. They're paid more one-on-one attention at home, usually because they're just closer to the family. And the other thing is they're exposed to less viruses at home. Every fall, the number of respiratory illnesses we get, there's just less people at home. So we have much more safety and as long as things are working at home. The indications for placement are when somebody can no longer be stable in the home environment, either because they've become too agitated or suspicious or angry or anxious at home in the night, when they're breaching the perimeter of the house and they're out on the road or trying to get out in the middle of the night and it's no longer safe, when they're at risk of setting a house fire, either because of smoking or because they're leaving the stove on in the middle of the night. And I've got many families who take off the stove knobs in the night, every night, as part of their nighttime ritual. But when it's absolutely unmanageable at home, that's when we talk personal care home and nursing home. And I hate to say this, but my job is to be the bad guy sometimes. My job is to be the person who says, now it's time. And sometimes it takes a lot of heat off the family and a lot of guilt off the family for the doctor to say, now it's time. And sometimes I even have to push hard because it's unsafe and really now it's time. And to the absolute extreme when we have to go to adult protective services and say now it is time because somebody is risking safety of self and others. So that's my answer to the question.
I think we're over time, but I think we'd maybe have time for one more brief response to question, and I think it'll be a nice way to cap the evening. So briefly, what kind of training would be useful for yourself and for the other members of this interdisciplinary team in this context, introducing spirituality into Alzheimer's care?
I think it's a question that a lot more attention has to be paid to. How do you introduce more spirituality into Alzheimer's care? And I don't think it's something that churches pay enough attention to. At the church I attend, we have a Care for Caregivers group that tries to address the needs of the people who are in fact caring for a patient, to address their particular needs from a practical point of view and a spiritual point of view. But there aren't any churches that have that kind of thing. And I think that's something that really needs more attention.
I've plagiarized before. I'll plagiarize right now Father Mike said that life is the school of love. It seems to me that that's the key lesson. And for those of you who expect a slightly more academic response, I'd say turn on your computer, look up Alzheimer's disease, look up Good Parent, and then read King Lear.
It's a very good question, and a question that's not been answered by very many people, I would say. There's a recognition of the need for spirituality, and yet taking the next step. How do we pull our resources together? How do we realize that if there's one thing we can all do to be an accessible other in the life of persons who are experiencing Alzheimer's, is to know that we can discover how to be with them as another person, to stay connected. I think so many people draw away. Well, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. And are there ways within the Alzheimer's Association for caregivers to discover some of those simple and regular things they can learn to do, so that they don't have, they can let go of that sense of separation because the person has the disease, and to cross that threshold and allow themselves to be there with them, not to go and to do something to them, but to be with.
Absolutely. We have as a matter of fact, you use the word connect. We have a course we call Reconnect.
Okay.
It does help caregivers with that.
Our spiritual lives were established as children. Our spiritual practices in the religious sense, within our religious centers of worship, because someone took us there and helped us learn how to connect with other people. And as we learned to worship, we realized that the worship was the work of the people, that we are people who long to have our spiritual lives awake and well. And we find that through our religious practices and by finding our place of faith. And to know that because a person has a disease doesn't mean that they're not still that rich, yearning soul to be connected to and with other people who are not coming to do anything to them or for them, but to be with them in that loving, kind, gentle, and precious way. That human being with the disease is made in the image of God. That makes them just like me and you, and that's enough. And to discover that we don't have to overplay the game. And then we can learn to sit and say, I'm going to close my eyes and pray. Do you want to pray with me? But I'm just going to pray. Or I'm going to sing this hymn in this book, and you begin to sing. Or you do nothing. I've just come to be here today. I think the presence from the person who's in the school of love, the way Mike gave his wife his presence.
I have the same answer, presence. Because I know that many of you are from local churches and community networks around here. And I think like the same way you have the ministries to come into the hospital and visit people when they're sick, and I know some churches bring a sacrament to them or bring a visit to them, that if a similar ministry was instituted with outpatient care and families were willing to have somebody come from the church and sitting during a doctor's visit, I don't think I would be averse to it. I think praying during the visit might be a little hard because of time constraints, but if that was to deepen the understanding of what the family is going through so that the community could then be supportive to that couple or that parent-child or whoever the caregiver happened to be, back home in their home setting to get an understanding of what they're going through. And not every visit, maybe every 4th visit or every 6th visit, that might be one way to do it. To train our staff, would be great to have lay ministers come in and do seminars with our trainees and with our staff in terms of how to make the care more spiritually aware. That would be perfectly reasonable. And I think generally for us to realize, as those of us who are healthcare professionals, that we're not just doing a healthcare professional's job here. Because there are moments there is honestly no answer for this disease. When you look at it, and I was just telling, I think, a couple of audience members, there's moments when you sit there just completely flabbergasted as a healthcare professional, and I know, I'm saying, oh God, help me with this one. And from somewhere the answer comes, you know? So I don't think any of us are alone with this disease, and so our job is really to be there. And we're taking somebody who starts off like us and ends up in a bed through that kind of a disease. And so if we remember that, I think it's so valuable because it reaches into the inside of us. And it finds our weakest and our best spots. And it finds our strengths and our weaknesses, and it shows them to us sometimes. And there are moments you're not happy with what you see, but there are other moments you realize that this illness may not have a cure, but it sure brings out the best in people. So thank you all.
Okay, so that concludes our program. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. If you'd consider filling out the survey that was included in your programs and attending our further events in March, April, May. We have some really exciting events that are also included there too. I would really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming, and get home safe.